All right. Hey, everybody. Today I have the very special privilege of being here with powerhouse Chinese Canadian author Jian, who has won a gazillion awards, including the highly coveted Bram Stoker Award for Linghun. That's just over here on my shoulder. We are here today to talk about your newest book, A Palace Near the Wind. So really excited to talk about that. Thank you very much for flying all the way from the UK just to be here with us today.
Thank you so much again for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, you bet. Me too. Me too. This is fantastic. So, of course, I had the honor of meeting you at one of our local author conventions that we had last year called DreadCon. It's kind of funny because I actually bought Linghun from you there before, of course,
Yeah.
this one was available. And thanks again too for sending this out. I know I said that to you before, but I really, really appreciate having this book sent out to me. I mean, what a beautiful, beautiful book too, and it's got tons of illustrations in there. I don't know if everybody that buys the book is going to be this lucky. Maybe you can tell us if we are, but I also got a couple of really cool placards in here as well. More beautiful artwork. And on here, you talk a bit about the inspiration for your book here, which I'm going to paraphrase, so please feel free to expand. You really took a couple of pretty important concepts between doing with to protect our environment or not to protect our environment, and ultimately the relationship that we have with the environment around us. And you also combine that with quite a bit of xenophobic concept where you essentially thrust your main character, Lu Fan, into this completely different, strange world that is a completely different environment. And if she has to really figure out how to adjust to these changes while protecting her environment, while trying to be conscientious of this new environment and where she fits in and what the heck she's supposed to do about all this. And those are really important concepts to have. I think a lot of us have that, but not everybody puts that into a fantastic story. So when did you know that you had enough to go off of to turn those concepts into an actual engaging story?
So usually I do not. I actually wrote this book back in like 2021, 2022. First as like 5 chapters for a workshop in the summer I did, and it was like a 7-day workshop. So obviously I could not, well, some people might be able to, but I couldn't finish a whole book. But I had started the book, but it didn't get finished until I think summer 2022 as a part of my thesis for my master's. So it was kind of like I started the story, but I wanted to finish it and I wasn't quite sure. But then because I had a deadline chasing me, it just kind of formed on its own, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Sometimes, like they say, diamonds are created under pressure, and it seems like that was maybe no exception for this book. So, and I know you mentioned before that sometimes you have some, pretty solid ideas of where you want to take the story, where you want it to go, but you're not really much of an outliner. So, with that in mind, how did you find that the story, especially with the play you wrote? I mean, the year 2020 was quite a bit different from 2022. I mean, 2020 was certainly, the dark ages and was really the perfect environment for talking about xenophobic nature. I mean, everybody was the other people. They're all the zombie that can make us sick and rip apart our family as we know it as far as the health goes. And isolation was kind of the thing. 2022 was starting to become more of a recovery year. Uh, how did your story evolve from how you anticipated it when you started it off with that 7-day crunch time and how it actually unfolded?
So I think it's interesting that you mentioned that because I feel like a lot of things that make it into my work, into my stories are like very unconscious, but reflective of my current state of mind during the time of writing. So when I wrote Linghun, it was like, I'll talk about that first because it connects
Sure.
to Palace. Um,
Okay.
it was during a time of like extreme isolation when I was in Edinburgh on my own, like staying in a room. And I basically did not um exit that room for like 2 weeks in a row. And I would just write from like 12 to 12. Not 12 to 12, 12 hours a day, but it would be like what was it? Like 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. type of thing. And then I would go to sleep. But because Edinburgh winters, like daylight is so short, I just like never saw the sun for 2 weeks, which really fed into the atmosphere. So I think it was like kind of similar to to when I started a palace near the wind, it was actually called Bone Diamond. Um, and while I was doing that workshop, even though it was the summer, it was the same thing. It was during COVID. We were like kind of confined in our homes, right? So then I feel like I grew a lot on that feeling of confinement and like that atmospheric dread while I was writing A Palace Near the Wind, especially the first half compared to the second half where it's kind of like breaking out from that confinement and the dread and like moving on to something a little more active versus the first half, I feel like I was drawn a lot more to passivity and like situations that we cannot control, especially because in my life at that time, it feels very much like that. You are in a situation confined which you cannot control.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, especially during 2020, way on the other side of the world, travel was not a good option.
Yeah, for sure.
I could see some of those frustrations eking into the story and throughout all of it. As far as the concept of balance, you certainly do have that sense of bleak isolation, but you also have a lot of hope, a lot of light, a lot of taking a stand and fighting for something and fighting against those internal struggles that I would think would take very different mindsets. I mean, did you find that pulling off those very two different perspectives, if you will, in the story, did that kind of come naturally to you, or did you have to approach that particular story in any maybe unique way compared to the other ones? Was it a matter of doing this scene during this mindset, both scenes during the other mindsets? I would love you to walk us through how you balance that out so perfectly.
So, one thing I like to tell my spouse, and he often likes to tell me, is that I seem very contradictory as a person. It's like I'm several people at once sometimes and have like very differing opinions that might change from like minute to minute. Um, and I definitely would describe myself as like a pessimistic optimist, if that makes sense. So I
Sure.
feel like that is something that kind of leaks through too, like in the sense that even in the most pessimistic or like negative situations, I will have a seed of hope because for me, it's like if you are already at the bottom, what can you look forward to but up, right? That kind of situation. So I feel like when I was writing this character specifically, I drew a lot on that sentiment. It's like if you are already in a terrible situation, there is already no falling further. You can only hope that tomorrow will be a better day. And you can only control your own mindset and your own actions, even if they are very limited.
No, really, really good way to put that. My other half as well. Wow, what the heck did she say to me once that just resonated? And as soon as she said that, that made me think back where she'd said, the only options you have might all be crappy options, but you can still pick the best choice for you out of all those crappy options,
Yes.
or something like that. Again, I'm paraphrasing. If she were here, she
Yeah.
would correct me and say, no, no, this is how it. But yeah, that totally resonates. And certainly with a lot of your characters too, not just Lu Fang. So many of them really have that juxtaposition, that balance where they kind of hit rock bottom. They don't really know where else to go, but they tend to make the best of it and they get pushed against the wall and then they don't always push back, but they in some ways embrace that wall and make the most out of it. A lot of the effectiveness with the Wind in the Palace comes from putting Lu Fen into a very foreign, really terrifying environment, on the premises of tradition, keeping the peace between her people and the people that would very much rather just simply bulldoze her home into oblivion and make it a part of theirs to expand, for the sake of what they consider evolution. What personal experiences or maybe even some research scenarios might you have drawn from to create such a believable story of, the sacrifice and xenophobia as well as hope?
So it's very interesting because when I first started writing the story, it was very much a meditation on like nature versus industrialism. And I remember reading a lot of articles about tourism and how like these natural destinations are being flooded with tourists and it's kind of destroying the landscape. But then at the same time, a lot of where these like natural environments are located, the economy kind of is driven by tourism and relies on it to survive. But then at like a more unconscious level, I realize it's also something I explore a lot in my other works, which is tradition versus like more, I wouldn't say modern, but let's just say like modern thought.
Sure.
Where like so like my grandmother, she comes from the rural side of China. It used to be like very old villages that are interconnected and like separate from the city, even though they are like still part of the city. But then her home was being torn down essentially to build condos. And a lot of the older generation who are still living in the villages, because a lot of the younger ones have left either abroad or like into the city for school, work, etc. Um, so a lot of the older generations were very against the demolition of the villages to create these condos, because even though they are like given units in these condos, it kind of destroys their way of life and their way of community building. And I think a lot of that seeped into a palace near the wind, where you have like the hollows that are like interconnected, where the Feng people live, versus like, the palace, which is like very separated, almost like condo units, right? You can't really see into each other's room, but it's like for some people, they love privacy, that works. But for a lot of villages where it's like everyone knows everyone's business, it's not the kind of lifestyle that they live.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, it certainly helps to have that sense of community in a smaller village. And I'm from Toronto originally, but I've also lived in probably a majority of my life, well, about half my life at least. I've lived a lot of small town Ontario. And in one sense, you've got a bit of unease and I guess sort of a built-in defense mechanism because everybody is in a smaller town, everybody knows your business. But
Mhm.
there's also a sense of community and, a sense of security. Everybody knows your business, sure, but you also gotta know everybody else's business. You know who your neighbors are, you know about, that strange guy that, he has a habit of walking up and down the street on his bicycle with funny hats or talking about weird things or something. And that's okay because that guy's a part of your community and it's stranger when he's not there. Toronto is, if it's not known for anything else, it's certainly known as a city that's just never fully happy with itself. It's constantly changing.
Mhm. I was thinking a lot about this too, because when I went to university, like doing my undergrad, it was in downtown Toronto and I had lived there for a bit. And especially in the summers, it seemed like it was just like perpetually under construction. And it's like you've been fixing this one road for like 5 years. Why is it not fixed? I'm so confused. And I feel like part of that also leaked into the story, where it's like everything just seems like half in construction, being like untiled and retiled, even though it's like a specific plot point or device in the book. But then in reality, it kind of reflects the same. It's like you've been retiling the same road. Like why? Why is it not
Right.
fixed?
It's almost to the point where it's, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of different reasons, and I certainly don't have the pay grade to probably pick the right one. And it could just be because they want to get bids, government funding, that kind of stuff. There's little bits of things to do behind the scenes that I guess you and I maybe just aren't privy to. But at the same time, it really does, from an outsider's point of view, seem like they're just doing this all the time in the same area simply because they feel that that's just what they're supposed to do. That's just the way it is. So why stop doing that? It feels like.
Yeah, I feel like I'm gonna need to go read some articles on this now. I'm very curious.
Right. Well, it's interesting because the King in the Palace, I found that very much, and a lot of the people that, so I guess his underlings and the people that were very much conformed to his his way of living, a lot of it I found came across as, well, they're just doing that because that's just what they're supposed to do. That's just their tradition, and they don't really know any other way. They might be curious, they might fear that what they're doing is wrong, but they don't really know any other way of doing that.
Hmm.
And of course, you've got other characters that kind of come in that just completely put things a little bit into chaos and,
Hmm.
kind of forces a different perspective on them. And also in turn has a different perspective sort of forced on her that Lu Fang is, and other characters maybe aren't really ready to process, but they have no choice.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was really interesting. And I know that a lot of the impact and the effectiveness of the Wind in the Palace I found really came from, again, casting a fan of this, foreign, completely terrifying environment. I love that she goes through quite the arc, to say the least. She's got a strong degree of fear and pain and struggling through more than just a little bit of deception. There's a lot of deception actually that kind of goes on. That I'm not. That's all I'm going to say because it's just absolutely fascinating to read. You got so many holy crap moments, or wow, I didn't see that coming. Even though you think you see what's coming,
Mm-hmm.
you really don't. And there's so much to digest and to process for our own filter, for our own experience and perspectives. But what do you hope that readers are ultimately going to take away with them after completing this epic sci-fi fantasy adventure?
So I would hope that readers come away with the idea that they should always be questioning what they know and what they think they know, not just about the world, but about themselves and the people around them. Because I feel like more often than not, we are often misunderstanding others. Kind of like the thing of like why they keep constructioning the same area. I'm sure they have a reason. I don't understand the reason, but it's kind of like to unpack these different questions we have for others based on like their motive or like, specific things they say, and perhaps it is interpreted a very different way in our minds than what they had intended, and try to kind of like pick apart our own interpretations of others and ideas, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And you could have very easily have turned this into your own proverbial soapbox and been heavy-handed and sit on top of that and say, embrace change. This is what you must do, or this is what's going to happen if you don't embrace change, or you should just conform to your own traditions because danger, danger around the corner. If God forbid you move away from your tradition and try to maybe fuse your traditions and what you know with other traditions and what their expectations are of your formity of that tradition. But you don't do that. In fact, I think you very much, I don't know if I would call it ambiguous because you definitely have very clear cut consequences for the characters in the story based on their own actions and the deceptions that they have to navigate around and through and such. But was that a conscious effort again on your part to think, okay, I need to pull back so it doesn't feel like I'm just berating people over the head with a sock full of pennies? Or did that come naturally because in real life, maybe your own opinions aren't so much heavy handed and you would much prefer just to say, here's the facts as I know them, discuss, filter, draw your own conclusions?
Definitely the latter, I would say. I think for this narrative, I really wanted to present a character who's like very much in their head, who is like very naive and innocent and don't know much about the world. So then, as they are learning more about the world, a lot of what they knew and understand gets very complicated, right? And I feel like that is something that often happens with many of my books because I often start with a question that I'm brewing on. And as I'm exploring this question and trying to answer it through the book, I realize, well, there really isn't an answer, but we'll see where this takes me. And more often than not, like the direction the book takes, as I'm writing it in trying to answer this question, the answer will be ever changing. So ambiguous, I think, is a good way of describing it. Because if I were to write the book again, let's say 5 years later, it would be a completely different book with a completely set, like different exploration of that same question, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And that's something I've always been a big component of as well is that, it's good to have very strong beliefs that you feel, at least at any given time, are unbending. But at the same time, I also find that if you have a new experience that gives you new perspective and you've got sort of a new lens or new information coming into you, that I think you owe it to yourself and kind of the world around you, really, because the world isn't one dimensional. It's a whole mishmash of various people, like it or not. We have to figure out how to sort of navigate along with those people. So I think that new information perspective in should probably inspire people to maybe
Mhm.
reassess their own opinion about something and think, does my opinion still stand based on a new perspective and a new, new information as it might come
Mhm.
available. Speaking of ambiguous nature that you do have throughout the book, as well as that clear cut consequences and cause and effect, really, is that even the characters themselves, certainly from Fen and a lot of the different machinery and mechanisms and environment that are in this new world that she's cast into, and maybe I'm just not that smart, but I found that you also left a lot of it to imagination. Certainly, you described the creatures, the way that they were built, the design of them all, Lu Fen and her family of within Fen. But you also left a lot of it to my own imagination as well, right? I thought, so she's walking with these certain clothes. So how is she going to do that? Because she's also kind of like a tree, but
Mhm.
she's not quite like an ant from the Lord of the Rings. So I don't know if that was intentional as well, but I love that. So I think that I could ask 10 different readers of this and they would have variations on like, if we could draw. I mean, I can't draw, but if people could draw, they might all draw something just a little bit different.
I think the thing with writing in first person for me is that there are very specific things that my main character will notice and will not notice. For example, if it's something you see and feel every single day, it might not be something that is specifically pointed out to
Right.
them. For example, it's like, let's say I walk up to my house and open my front door. I'm probably not going to notice anything about my house or anything about my front door versus someone who is like an outsider coming to my house for the first time. They're gonna look at it and be like, wow, all these details that they notice type of thing, right? Or it's like, oh, they have like an electric lock instead of a key and hole kind of lock, things like that. But then if you're coming home every single day to the same house, to the same like opening the same front door, you might not notice those things. So I kind of try to take that approach, which I have discovered can be either very fascinating or very frustrating, depending on the type of reader that comes into the book. Whereas some readers really want you to be extremely detailed in the description so they can imagine everything exactly as you have imagined it. Whereas some readers are okay with just diving in and experiencing the story as it is and filling in the gaps that you've left them like little trails for.
Yeah, I definitely prefer the latter. I love to use my own imagination, and I think a lot of readers certainly these days, and certainly not to put any other genres down, but I think certainly in the dark fantasy, certainly the sci-fi crowd as well as the horror crowd are very educated, are very smart, clever people that have a great imagination. That's why they read what they read. So I think it's almost more fascinating and even more scarier if you have to use your own imagination as well, because you're not being spoon fed absolutely everything. It's kind of like folks when they're talking about H.P. Lovecraft, how he often
Mhm,
describes colors that are just not describable. And it's like, well,
mhm.
can you try? But at the same time, you also give us just enough that we can fill in the blanks and we can use our own imaginations if we wish to.
Yeah, I feel like whenever I'm writing, I love doing things like, let's say you meet a character, sometimes people will give, the full view of the character, but I might just mention something like, oh, this character has one gold tooth and shoulder pads, and that's all you get.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. No, and I really like the approach that you took. I'd love to talk to you for a minute if I can. I mentioned it briefly about like beautiful illustration here, as well as throughout the rest of the book. Was that something that your publisher went and said, "Hey, we're going to get an illustrator and have them illustrate and design the book," or did you kind of have any say in that as far as any feedback on what you wanted some of those illustrations to look like? I mean, after all, it's your world that they were helping to bring to visual life.
So my publisher has an in-house designer, and then basically what happened was I sent a lot of um inspiration images, like general art or like covers that I've liked that I think they can take the direction in. And then I sent it to my editor, and then my editor put together a cover brief for the designer. And then the resulting cover I got, I made some notes and then sent it back, which they were very open to, which was lovely because sometimes you don't always get that liberty. So yeah, so the resulting cover is basically the original, and then with some of my feedback added in.
Perfect. And who is the designer, if I might ask? And I'm trying to put you on the spot. Natasha McKenzie. Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
lovely, lovely work.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's just beautiful. And I mean, again, I really love the combination. I was just talking with an author about that last night who also had a fully illustrated book. And maybe that's just the kid inside of me where I like kind of pictures when I'm reading the book as well. But it's just a really cool way to add to the additional immersion. It was such a fascinating thing when I got to know you a little bit better on the panel that we shared at the DreadCon
Hmm.
is that you talked about having really no specific style for a publisher or reader to be able to take a pin in. This book is obviously no exception. I would argue that between Palace Near the Wind and Linghun, they do tend to share a bit of a folk style, which,
Mm.
in both of them I found that it puts these families, smack dab in the middle of these intense conflicts within, I mean, really strange, really uncomfortable environments. Now, is it safe to say that this family-oriented folk style, that it might be the one constant thread throughout all of your stories, or was that just simply by accident, and maybe that's just my own interpretation that maybe you don't share with your own work?
I would say yes. I think familial conflicts does recur throughout my work. But I think it's like half of my work, and then the other half is a kind of more internal self conflict, I guess, where like someone is trying to grapple with a specific event they're going through or like a part of their identity, things like grief and loss or cultural identity. Um, yeah, so I think a lot of people who have read my work, they would also describe it as like melancholic, but also hopeful.
That's very accurate. And I know certainly with Palace Near the Wind, I found that a lot of those senses that you get and a lot of the emotional ride that you take on, there's a little bit more chaos in that. And I found that there was certainly more dynamics to our sensory. Whereas I found that with Lin Hun, it was very, I hate to say the word linear because it sounds like it's
Mm.
just, that sounds boring and that story is anything but boring. You've got a Bram Stoker award to prove that that's not the case. But I found that it was certainly this, as far as the sense of dread and loneliness and isolation, there there was certainly a little bit of hopeful aspects to that, but there was also just a strong undertone of just this sadness and just simply settling for as good as it's gonna get kind of thing. Whereas I found things tended to be a little bit more hopeful and a bit more uplifting. So there was a lot more, what do we call those, like tummy hills, when you're going down a long hill, it's like,
Mm.
kind of going up and down with it all. One thing I know that, again, this being such a vastly different story from your ghost story, uh, although it still tends to blow our minds, my mind at least, in a very different way. What do you say to the people that might be like, "Geez, I don't know what to expect from this writer lady because she just all of her stories are so unique and different. I came for the ghost stories, and now she's giving me forest creatures." What do you say to the horror crowd who absolutely fell in love with your Lin Un story that might be a little bit shy about reading what you can do with sci-fi and fantasy?
I have defaulted to just telling people coming into my work to have no expectations, to just go in and experience it when you are looking for like a new experience, not like specific tropes or like a specific narrative or specific genre. You just want to experience something maybe a little different.
Perfect. Personally speaking, a lot of my favorite authors, they're really kind of a genre in itself. I can certainly think of no better author who's influenced generations, Richard Matheson. He was the first author that I ever read a hardcore sci-fi story, and because it was in part of a collection of various other stories that he wrote. And I'm thinking, I had no idea I like sci-fi. I guess I just like a good story. And if you don't mind me saying so as well, I think that's what people get with you is just fantastic storytelling that's going to push the boundaries of their perspective and maybe how they look at the world. And despite the genre, a good story is a good story, and I find that's your trademark is just great storytelling.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I hate to say this too, because we talk about these amazing stories, and then I always feel kind of half bad at the end. Say, so what are you doing for us lately here? What's coming next? I know, and I don't remember where it was. I think I asked you on one of the social medias, and you're like, steampunk, what are you talking about? And I lost track of that. But I could have swore that in the back of this book, or I think it might have been Linghun, or maybe somewhere else. I might have had a dream about this. That I could have swore that you mentioned something about how you have an interest in maybe even exploring a steampunk styled story. Am I just making all that up, or did I actually read that somewhere?
I think it wasn't steampunk, it was cyberpunk, but yeah.
Cyberpunk.
So,
Thank you.
so my next book is also one of those like tradition versus progress type of books where you kind of mix the ancient and the far future. So it is like ancient vibes, but not quite magical, and then very far future cyberpunk vibes.
Very cool. And now, are you still writing that? Are you editing that? Is your publisher a very lucky person that has that on their desk?
So Titan is publishing it next September, but I think
Awesome.
that specific cyberpunk book that I was talking about is like also the novelization of Give Me English. Um, which, yeah, so one of my stories featuring a society where language is used as currency. Um, but as I was putting together like my notes and stuff for it, it originally was meant to be very, very cyberpunk, but now it feels a little more like light spec because I'm not a very like hard sci-fi writer, mainly because I just don't have, the knowledge pool for it. So the way I write science feels a lot more philosophical, not so much like implemented, but more like reflective, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so there's also that book. It's like light cyberpunk, I guess, but also like literary spec and kind of thrillerish. I don't know. I don't know what it is. We'll see if it ever
It's
gets.
100% Jian. That's what it is. Perfect. So that's no, that's fantastic. So we'll definitely be looking forward to that. That next September as well. Then, and I love that about Titan is that they do tend to get the books out well in advance. So anybody that's watching this, hopefully you don't mind me putting a shout out to viewers. Go ahead and maybe get in touch with Titan as well, because I've dealt with them on a few different authors, and they're fantastic. They're just great people to deal with. They give reviewers lots of notice, which is great. Not the first reviewer that says, "Hey, can you review my book? It's coming out next week." Wow. Especially if you want to get into periodical that they're already thinking 2 issues out. So really appreciate it. And it makes it easier for reviewers like me to help to promote authors that we love as well, and being able to make sure that we get that into our schedule. So kudos to you, Titan. Thank you very much. Thanks for being awesome to your authors. And thank you for being an awesome author as well. I really appreciate that. I do want to say to everybody watching this, if you do like this kind of stuff, the one thing you can do that is free, quick, and easy to help spread the word about I's work is to simply hit the like button. And it'll draw the video and this conversation into more people like you who could really benefit from enjoying fantastic works of I, and hopefully keep in touch down the road for when the new book comes out. I know you're traveling all over the world doing signings, various things like that. You're a globe-trotting writer. If people want to try to find you at a con to meet you personally, have your book signed, or just want to know what are you doing now, what are you doing next, where's the best place for them to do that?
So you can take a look at my website, which is basically my name and then .ca. But I will be at StokerCon, WorldCon, DragonCon, and World Fantasy this year. Maybe CanCon. We will see.
That is awesome. And thank you very much. And everybody, of course, I am going to put those links down below. Get zoomed right over iSpace on the net. Thank you very much again. I really appreciate this.
Thank you again for having me and to everyone for listening.